Did you know that in a single meeting, a handful of powerful men, most of whom had never even set foot in Africa, sat around a polished table, unfolded a map of the continent, and began drawing lines across it like it was a blank canvas? They didn't ask for permission. They didn't consult a single African leader. They didn't care about the cultures, languages, or people who lived there. In a matter of hours, they divided entire civilizations. Centuries of history were ignored. Tribes were split. Enemies were forced together. And all of it was done in the name of power, greed, and control. This wasn't just a political decision. It was the beginning of one of the greatest land grabs in human history. And it all happened in one room, at the Berlin Conference. This isn't a movie plot. It's not fiction. It's not some dystopian script written for dramatic effect. This actually happened. In 1884, leaders from the most powerful empires in the world, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and others, gathered in Berlin. But they didn't come to stop a war. They didn't come to negotiate peace. They came to divide an entire continent like businessmen negotiating over slices of a pie. There were no African leaders in the room. Not a single representative from the lands they were dividing. The people who lived there, millions of them, had no idea this meeting was even happening. They didn't get a vote. They didn't get a voice. And yet, their lives, their borders, their cultures, were all about to be rewritten. Why? Why would these European powers feel entitled to take lands that weren't theirs? What gave them the authority to draw borders across territories they barely understood? Let's break it down. It all started with one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. He was a monarch with grand ambitions and an even greater appetite for wealth and power. On the surface, he presented himself as a humanitarian, a noble figure determined to bring civilization to Africa. He claimed he wanted to end slavery, build schools, spread Christianity, and bring peace to a dark continent. It sounded noble. It sounded heroic. But it was all a lie. Beneath the surface, Leopold's true motives were far more sinister. His goal wasn't peace. It wasn't progress. It was profit. And he was willing to do anything to get it. He realized early on that Africa was rich, almost unimaginably rich, in natural resources. We're talking about gold, rubber, ivory, timber, and minerals buried deep in the earth. Europe, in the late 1800s, was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Factories needed raw materials. Markets needed expansion. Machines needed fuel. And Leopold saw Africa as the perfect source and playground for imperial exploitation. But there was a problem. He couldn't just invade a continent on his own. So, he used a clever strategy. He sent out so-called explorers, men like Henry Morton Stanley, to map out territories and make contact with local chiefs. Stanley was tasked with convincing, or manipulating, tribal leaders into signing treaties. These documents, often misunderstood or mistranslated, handed over control of land to Leopold's private enterprise. It wasn't diplomacy. It was deception. These contracts weren't agreements between equals. They were traps, tools of colonial trickery designed to legitimize conquest. And behind every signature, Leopold was one step closer to building his private empire, the Congo Free State. But make no mistake, free had nothing to do with it. It was a corporate colony, ruled not by Belgium, but by Leopold personally. And what followed would become one of the most brutal and exploitative regimes in modern history. King Leopold's actions didn't go unnoticed. Once the other European powers realized what he was doing, securing vast territories in Africa and extracting unimaginable wealth, they wanted in. Fast. France, Britain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, and even Spain began launching their own expeditions. They sent soldiers, merchants, missionaries, and diplomats, all with the same goal: grab land before someone else did. Africa was no longer a distant land of mystery. It was now the center of a global power game, one driven by greed, competition, and empire building. The so-called scramble for Africa had begun. In just a few years, European flags were being planted across African soil at a dizzying pace. No one cared about borders, cultures, or the people who already lived there. Lines were drawn not with dialogue, but with bayonets and ink pens. It wasn't negotiation, it was occupation. Rival countries claimed the same territories, often based on vague explorations or forged treaties. British expeditions would arrive in a region only to find French outposts already established. German settlers would show up to land claimed by the Portuguese for centuries. Everyone was racing to conquer, to control, to dominate. And the pace was brutal. European governments were terrified of being left behind. They feared that if they didn't act quickly, they would miss their chance at colonial glory. It was a geopolitical gold rush. The rules were unclear. The ethics were non-existent. The stakes were enormous. Tensions flared. Skirmishes broke out. In some places, war seemed inevitable. Europe was on the brink of turning Africa into a battlefield, not just between colonizers and Africans, but among the colonizers themselves. Something had to be done. A meeting had to be called. And that's exactly what happened next. By 1884, the competition for African land had spiraled out of control. With European powers tripping over one another to claim territories, chaos was brewing, not just in Africa, but in European diplomatic circles. Skirmishes over colonial claims were threatening to escalate into full-blown war. So, Germany, newly unified and eager to flex its geopolitical muscles, stepped in to organize a solution. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, known more for his power politics than humanitarian values, invited the major imperial players to Berlin. The goal? Bring order to the madness. At least, that's how they framed it. In November of 1884, representatives from 14 countries gathered in Berlin. Not one African nation was invited. Not a single African voice was heard. The people whose land was being divided weren't just ignored, they were deliberately excluded. Among the attendees, Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and even the United States, though it had limited interest in African colonies. Each nation came with maps, ambitions, and an appetite for expansion. The meeting lasted for months. Behind closed doors, these men debated trade routes, river access, and civilizing missions. But the real agenda was clear: draw lines, set rules, and avoid conflict among themselves, not with the Africans, but with each other. They called it diplomacy. History remembers it as imperial division. No regard was given to the cultures, languages, kingdoms, or tribal boundaries that had existed in Africa for centuries. They used maps and rulers, literally. Lines were drawn straight through mountains, deserts, rivers, and communities. Ethnic groups were split. Rival tribes were forced together. Entire nations were created or erased on paper. It was like slicing a cake at a party none of the guests had been invited to. The final result? A document called the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which laid out the rules for claiming African territory. A country had to occupy the land and inform others. Simple as that. This gave legal cover to the upcoming wave of invasion, conquest, and colonization. By the end of the conference in 1885, Europe had effectively legalized the plunder of a continent. Africa wasn't seen as a place of people, history, or culture. It was seen as a resource, something to be owned, mined, and ruled. What came next was one of the most brutal chapters in modern history. The Berlin Conference was over by early 1885. But its consequences were just beginning. Before the conference, less than 10% of Africa was under European colonial control. Most of the continent was still governed by independent kingdoms, empires, and communities, some ancient, some recently formed. But within just a few decades, the map of Africa changed completely. By 1914, on the eve of World War I, an astonishing 90% of the African continent had been swallowed by European powers. Only two nations, Liberia and Ethiopia, remained officially independent. The rest had been carved up and renamed: British East Africa, French West Africa, German Southwest Africa, and so on. Entire civilizations were dismantled. Languages were banned. Religions were suppressed. Borders drawn by Europeans forced rival ethnic groups into the same territory, while separating others that had lived in harmony for centuries. This artificial restructuring planted the seeds for conflicts that still affect Africa to this day. And then there was King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold didn't just claim land, he took personal ownership of an entire country, the Congo Free State. It was his private property, not a Belgian colony at first. He exploited it ruthlessly, under the guise of bringing civilization and Christianity. But the reality was a nightmare. Villages were burned. Families were torn apart. Children had their hands cut off if quotas weren't met. People were enslaved to extract rubber, ivory, and minerals for European markets. It's estimated that during Leopold's rule, up to 10 million Congolese people died, from forced labor, violence, starvation, and disease. And yet, for years, much of the world turned a blind eye. It wasn't until whistleblowers, like missionaries, former officials, and African survivors, exposed the truth that international pressure began to mount. Leopold was eventually forced to give up his private colony in 1908, but the damage was already done. The story of the Berlin Conference didn't end in that room in Germany. It echoed through decades of colonial brutality, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure. It shaped the political boundaries of modern Africa, and in many ways, it set the stage for the struggles that would follow even after independence movements swept the continent in the mid-20th century. The conference was a quiet meeting in a European city, but its aftermath was millions of lives changed, lost, and forgotten. The Berlin Conference wasn't just a simple meeting between European powers. It was a moment that reshaped the future of an entire continent. When they met in 1884, they weren't merely drawing borders on a map. They were drawing lines through the hearts and lives of millions of people. It's easy to look at the artificial borders of Africa today, straight lines that cut across mountains, deserts, and rivers, and think of them as natural or inevitable. But these borders weren't created by the people who lived there, nor by any respect for the land or its history. They were imposed by foreign powers, who had no understanding of the deep cultures and complex societies already in place. What was once a thriving, diverse continent of kingdoms and empires, each with their own traditions, beliefs, and ways of life, was now broken into disjointed territories, often with no consideration for the people within them. The conference didn't just divide land, it fractured identities and displaced entire cultures. It destabilized communities that had lived in relative peace for centuries, pushing them into constant conflicts and struggles that continue to echo in modern Africa. Generations of Africans were affected by decisions made by men who'd never even seen their homeland. This isn't just an African story, it's a reminder for the world. History isn't always fair. It's often shaped by the voices that are heard and the voices that are ignored. The powerful countries who met in Berlin, with their ambitions of wealth, power, and expansion, were deaf to the voices of the people they affected. They ignored the indigenous African leaders, the farmers, the traders, the warriors, who had lived on the land for generations. The very people whose lives would be irrevocably altered by these decisions were never even invited to the table. And sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones missing from the room. The most significant decisions aren't always made by the people who speak the loudest or the most often, but by those who have no choice but to live with the consequences. As we look back at the Berlin Conference, we must remember that the real impact wasn't just on the map. It was on millions of lives, histories, and futures that were changed forever. It's a lesson for us all. Power is often exercised in silence, and the true cost of ignoring voices is felt long after the meeting is over. If this story about the Berlin Conference shocked you, or made you look at history in a completely new way, don't just scroll away. Hit that like button to let us know that you want to hear more untold stories from history. Stories that expose the truths behind the headlines, the ones that shape the world we live in today, but often get overlooked. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a deep dive into the hidden moments of history that have long been ignored. From the dark corners of colonialism to the unsung heroes who fought for freedom, we're here to bring those stories to light. We're just getting started, and there's much more to uncover. Now, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What did you think about the Berlin Conference and its consequences? Should we dive even deeper into what really happened in the Congo after this meeting? The truth is shocking, and it's a story that needs to be told. Let us know what you think, and share this video with your friends so they can learn about this crucial moment in history too. And hey, turn on the notifications so you never miss an episode, because when it comes to history, there's always more to explore.